Hello and welcome to another video. So this time around we're going to be taking a look at two different but closely related areas. One is analytics and the other is remote configuration. So analytics allows us to get information about how things are going in our game and what people are actually doing in the game. So we can get data like what kind of items, things like if that people are using, how much of different things people are collecting, where people are getting to in the game. So it allows us to identify and get measurable data there for identifying potential problems. So we could spot things where, okay, well, 90% of our players are only using this one item. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there's something wrong with the other items? Does that mean that there's something a little bit overpowered with this item? Does it mean that there's something wrong in other aspects of the design that mean that item becomes a must-have thing? We can see how many of our players are getting to different stages in the game, so we can see if there are points that are causing people to nope out of it. And those are really useful things to get so we can start to get some hard data to work out how can we improve our game. And then remote config kind of can be used for this, but doesn't have to be, but can dovetail nicely with that because it allows us to have different settings for our game that we can control on a server. So that means we could put out a development build, for example, that has one set of settings. We could have a production build. We could have versions of those settings change. So maybe we've got a problem in a specific level, and in that level, we want to turn on really verbose logging for everyone. We could do that with a config setting that we can control remotely so that everyone gets that configuration so we can get the data to track down the particular problems. So two related things, but they both come in really handy for us being able to actually do some very, very neat tricks. So let's dive on in. And the one that we're going to start with first is analytics. And the analytics one is actually going to, you'll notice there'll be a little bit of a jump with the analytics where we'll do a bunch of setup stuff and then we'll come back and see the data a bit later. As in actual real world time will have passed for me and I'll fix it in through the magic of editing. The reason for that is there are some fairly strict limits with the analytics in terms of the amount of data that's able to come through and also in terms of the time delay on when you get access to that data. So I'll bring up, and I'll put this link in the description below. With the analytics, there are some fairly strict limits in terms of how much data is able to come through and sort of rates there. And so some key things is so when we're sending an bit of analytics, that's sent through as an event. So an event, we can only send 100 of them per user per hour. But that single event can contain 10 parameters. So we want to be a little bit cautious and selective with what data we send and try and find opportunities to bundle it together. So we can send 1,000 parameters per hour per user. So it's a reasonable amount of data, but we want to be a little bit cautious with it. Now, to be able to tell that data has gone through, there is some developments, looks like, for getting some earlier ways of being able to see the data. For the moment, it's a little bit of a manual way of how we can actually check it. But a big thing is going to be checking these results. So let's get started. First thing we need to do, there's actually a couple of packages that we need to bring in. So the analytics stuff, we don't have access to it by default. We have to actually bring this into the project using Package Manager. So we want to go to the Unity registry, and there's two things we're going to bring in. So one is the analytics library. So these analytics and remote configuration are two completely separate things. We're looking at them together because they dovetail really nicely, but they are two very separate things. So we'll bring in the analytics library, and then once we've brought that in, we'll also bring in the remote configuration library. So come down here, we've got remote config. Let's bring that in. and then we will be able to get some stuff set up. So, key things we need to be doing with this is there's actually a little bit of initial setup we have to do. So if we go to Window, and then under General, what we're looking for is Services. And you can see, by default, Analytics is off. So if we click on Analytics, we want to turn this on. So that means we need to actually create a project ID. So you'll need to be signed in with your Unity account for this. Now you'll see I have two ones visible there. One is me as in me, the person, and the other is the company because I publish some assets for Unity projects. So in this case, I'm going to have it be as me, the person. And then I want to create the project ID. Now, before I click on Create Project ID, I want to go to Player and make sure that I've got an actual product name set, because this is going to be associated with that product name. So go back to Analytics, and then again, I select who it's being created for. I can go Create Project ID. That will take a little bit. And it will tell me that the Analytics is being sort of configured. Now this, you will see this screen saying, okay, well, play to complete the integration, pressing play, it's going to send data to validate it. This will always stay up. This is something that's been changed in somewhat recent Unity versions. This will not disappear. So if you're expecting to hit play and then it doesn't disappear, it's not that anything is wrong. This is expected behavior that's going to happen there with the analytics. But with this set up, we can now start to actually set up a couple of our analytics. So I'm going to create an empty object because there's a few different ways we can send analytics. And I'm going to show you one way initially. So analytics sender. And we'll create a folder for our scripts. So with the analytics, we can send, in a lot of cases, we'll be sending what's called a custom event. So one where we're sending custom package data there. So analytics sender. So with this, I'm going to bring in Unity Engine.analytics, because we're going to need that. Now, the actual sending of these analytics, if we remember, we've got our limit there of 100 per user per hour. So it's 100 events that we can send, but an event can contain more complex data. So what we're going to do is just send a simple event to begin with. Now, we need to bring in Unity Engine.analytics. And then with that, what we can do is analytics. Then we can go, okay, well, custom event. And then we can say, okay, we've got a couple of built-in things here. So remember, an event can contain multiple parameters. So we could just send the event. We could also send the event with a position, or we can send it with a dictionary where we're sending through much more information there. So there's a lot of extra things that we can be sending there. We can also take a look and see under analytics the other sort of events that we have got. So we can set through some basic user information. Something to keep in mind there is potential privacy requirements that might be in place. And those privacy requirements do vary around the world. So if you are collecting anything in terms of data there, do make sure you are checking what any privacy requirements are there, just so that your game is not actually in breach of any of those requirements, because there are strict requirements there often, so make sure you're checking that. So we've got a few different things there, but I'm going to send a custom event, and I'm just going to send initially a custom event that just has a location. So location, and it'll just be whatever the position of this is. Now I want to grab the result of that so that I can log that out. This is how I tell if this has actually worked in terms of sending it. And I'm doing this testing in start, not in update, because I want to avoid hitting the upper limit in terms of that 100 events per hour. So if we run this, what we're hoping to see is our result down here. And we're not seeing our result because, as always, the most common problem, forgetting to attach the script. So let's run this again, and we'll see. So we got an OK back. That's good. That's what we want to see. That means that it successfully sent that bit of data. Let's go and send something a bit more complicated then. If we go and with this, we're going to grab the result again, but this time we're going to send a custom event, and this might be player state. So we might want to periodically send through the player state, could be useful information there. And we want to send through a dictionary. So a new dictionary, string object, and I'll put this into a separate line just so it's a little bit easier to process. So our state, it's a new dictionary, and what we're going to do is we're going to add some data into that. So state, and we're going to log that result out again, just because we want to confirm each time that it's working. So that state, well, let's set a few things. We could have health. And that health, that might be, 57. We might want to send through, they might have other stats there, might be the sort of current speed that they're moving. So let's check in a float. Speed, that might be 1.23. So a floating point number. We might want to send through the level that they're in. So that might be intro. So each one of these is a different parameter. So if we remember limit-wise, I could send through 10 things here and no more than that. So I could send through 10 individual items with that, and that's just something we need to keep in mind. There are also limits in terms of the length of these names. Again, these limits are described sort of here. So a single sort of event is limited to 500 bytes of data or 100 characters in the event name. So we do need to be mindful of those limits. But that's why we're logging out the result, so that we know that the data is coming through. And we really need to make sure we do this testing before this stuff goes live, because there's nothing worse than having it set up and like, cool, I've got everything in, all these analytics in, I'll get heaps of useful data, and if you've made a mistake and you're getting none of that analytics data, you're losing a whole bunch of information there. So let's run this again, and we'll be able to see. So we're looking for getting OK back twice this time. And we did, which is good. So we know that data, it's saying that, yep, that data is fine, it's being sent, which is good. We do also have, there is this analytics event tracker component. With this, we can use it to have stuff that goes through on a timer. It can be linked up to UI, or it can happen in terms of particular life cycle events. So when something, start, awake, destroy, a whole bunch of key events that we can kick stuff off here. And this is where it starts to get really cool. We can apply rules. How many times is this able to be repeated? The particular rules. We can check and see, okay, well, is this game object equal to, this other thing? We can check particular fields on it. So I can drag in the camera, and we can see any of our parameters here. So we can start to set up some really complex rules in the inspector for controlling when these events come through. There's a bunch of built-in events there in terms of level complete and things like that. And these have predefined sets of information. So for example, if I pick level complete, then, okay, I can enable, so in this case, the level name is enabled. So this might be intro. Now, level index is currently set to disabled, it's turned off. So I could turn this on and then have to provide a particular value. I could also set it to dynamic, and then it can pull from another object. So if we had an object that was, say, our level manager, and it currently held the name or the index, we could pull that information dynamically from that anytime it goes to send this event, which is really cool. So I don't tend to use the analytics event tracker a lot. I usually prefer to set up just the custom events myself because I feel very comfortable with that, with controlling the timing of it. But that analytics event tracker is incredibly powerful, and you can do a lot of really, really cool things with it. Now, the one concern that I would have is just making sure, and we would need to go and directly edit the code, is whether the analytics event tracker will give us a notification that it sent stuff through or if something has gone wrong. Because with this, if I set the lifecycle event to be on start, it's going to run, but we won't necessarily get an indication here that it's run. So that's something where that is a little bit of a downside with it, and why I tend to not use it, because you don't get that explicit indication there of whether it's working or not. And because of the time delay on seeing analytics data, you won't always be able to immediately know. Now, there is apparently some changes being worked on for that might improve this, but that is the situation at the moment. Because if I want to then see my analytics data, so I can do this by services is one way to get there. So even though, again, it's sent data, it'll still always say this, so don't be alarmed if you see that. But you can directly go to the dashboard. So I'm going to bring up the dashboard for the project. And this is what we will see currently. Nothing is here and coming through, and that is because there is that time delay there. So we will be able to see those come through, but there is just that time delay. We can also take a look and see what we would actually get in terms of these, and I can actually illustrate what these look like for a previous project where we can see some of the data. So this is a previous project of mine where people were making decisions in, and with this you could make all of these different choices. So I've got these custom events here in terms of what choices did people make, what pads did they stand on, what scenes were loaded, how many times have each scene been loaded, just as those were handy things to be aware of. And then you can start to look at the data. Now, this is stuff where I can see, okay, there was, a few users active at this point in time. So this is one of the cool and interesting things to see. This is quite an old game, so I'm really kind of surprised that there are active users still, but that's very cool. You can see things, and with all of these, there's often a little question mark, so you can see more info. So in this case, sticky factor, it's measuring, ones where they've been playing it, likely to return. You can see stuff here like new users, so I can see there's some new users here, which is cool. You can start to look at data in terms of sessions. So this is how many times each person is sort of typically playing it. Now, in the case of this game, it's not one that's intended as a thing that you are likely going to be replaying a lot. You can also see the sort of playtime, which the game is about a 10 to 15 minute one. So those look about sort of where I'd be expecting. You can see stuff in terms of retention, so that's going to be people returning. Again, this isn't a game where that's actually an expected thing. And revenue is if you've got things like in-app purchase. So that's cool. We can start to see some of that data. But we can also then start to, with a data explorer, well, okay, I'm not interested in the daily active users, but let's take a look at some of my custom events. So, okay, I want to look at the decisions, and I can say, okay, how many on the game, how many users chose to invert the y-axis? And with this, I can get rid of daily active users. So I can see, okay, there was one here, another one here, and we can also vary the time that this is looking over, because this is looking over a fairly short time period. So if we go back to there, see if it'll show us a larger chunk of data. But we can look and see where these different ones are happening. And depending upon the particular data, it might be most useful as a column chart. These ones we could also look at as a table. So we can see one user with invert y set to true, one with invert y set to false. I can take a look and see the kinds of decisions they made. So decisions, I can say, okay, well, in room 2, did they choose left? You can see first person chose left, second person chose right. We can then check and see, okay, well, that's cool. Let's take a look and see what did they do in room 3. So if we go to, actually that's right, room 3 doesn't have a choice in it. Room 4 though, we can see in room 4, everyone made the same choice. So I'm starting to be able to see, okay, that would be something if I saw a lot of data on that would be a thing where it's like, okay, maybe those choices are not balanced properly. Maybe I need to address and change some things there. I can also take a look and get a sense of how decisive people were, because I also track these pad counts. So again, I can say, okay, well in room 2, what was the pad counts? So this is the number of times someone stepped on a pad. And we can see that in this case, people were pretty decisive. They stepped on the pad once, and that was it. So this is really useful data that we can see. When we zoom in a little bit to make it a little bit easier to see, this is the kind of information that comes through in those custom events. So really handy being able to look at these. We can download this data as a CSV. We can also then chuck in other metrics in terms of, okay, well, I want to get rid of that custom event, but this metric, if we wanted to look at, things like the total daily play time and all of these different settings, we've got a huge amount of data that we can put together. We can, create reports from these, have that saved as something so we can easily go back and check it later. Lots of really useful information that we're able to access. We can also start to set up things like segments, and there'll always be some automatic ones there, and they'll have ones that are life cycle, things like based upon geography, so lots of data there. Also the various ones related to monetization. Not going to get into the problematic aspect with in-app purchases, but that's something where if you are putting in-app purchases in your project, make sure you look at ways of doing that ethically and responsibly. That's, I think, a very important thing if you are using in-app purchases. But we can set up segments for analyzing things like that. We can set up these things like funnels, so getting a sense of level progression, where people have gotten to in our actual projects. So really, really handy in terms of being able to gather this data. So that's the kind of information for an existing project. Now, as I said, we won't have the data currently for our example project because that does take time to actually come through. But what I will do through the magic and power of editing is I will actually suddenly, in a moment, there will be the data from this project. Possibly also with a clothing change, depending upon how long that delay ended up being. Okay, so some time has passed and we do now have data available. So to give a bit of a sense of how long this took, this was about 12 hours. was the time from the recording of the video to then the data being available. I was checking continually during that time just so I could have a fairly accurate picture, and I also had a couple of projects that I tested beforehand, and they all consistently were about sort of 12 hours. Now that time is going to potentially vary a bit, but generally you should assume probably several hours to half a day, near a full day before the data comes through. But once it's here, we can see in our event manager, so those different parameters that we set up, so our player state, and we can see a few of the things that we had that were coming through. So we provided the speed, level, intro. These are the latest versions of those. We can see the location information that was being passed through. Level complete was the other one, the one that we set up through the analytics event tracker. So that has come through successfully. So we've got that information there. We're able to see that. As soon as it's there and available in the event manager, that means we can start to do things like in our data explorer, actually look at our custom events. And we can look at those for different segments, so for different areas. And then we can take a look and see, okay, well, what information came through in terms of health, for example? And a lot of these are going to be most useful to look at as the actual sort of raw CSV data. We can see we had 2 entries come through there for health, so that's giving us a count. We could actually take a look at what the average value was. So the types of controls and settings we get here are going to vary based upon the particular data. So in this case, because it's numeric data, we can average it or we could be summing it. Depending on the information, that'll control the stuff we get. If we went instead for level, we won't actually have information like the count there, but we'll be able to see, we'll only have the count and we'll be able to see the information. We could chuck in a additional one, so like of location. So location, we can look at the X, Y, and Z separately. So it doesn't have an understanding in this of position as an actual vector 3 kind of thing. We would have to individually split those values out. We also can then, if we take a look at, say, our level complete one, then we want the level name, and that's just going to give us the actual values that have come through, but we could be downloading the raw data, things like that. That's going to let us be able to see the kinds of information there. In terms of metric, we might be able to see information like the number of sessions per user, which is not really going to be particularly high because we've only had a single sort of session happening there. But this gives us a sense of the data we're able to see. As I said, we can see things in the event manager. Raw data export is not something we can access without the Pro subscription. So without that, we're not able to get the actual sort of full set of data. This also lets you get the information in a more rapid time period as well. So really handy for being able to access that, but it does come with the Pro subscription. So as long as you're planning out carefully, then you'll be able to gather the data, wait for the stuff to run. As I said, make sure you do your own internal testing. And in terms of that internal testing, make sure you test that you're getting data from a build before you actually put that build out into the wild, just so that you can confirm that you're absolutely receiving data there. It's just an important thing so that you can rely on the fact you will be getting information from it. So that's the key stuff there for analytics. Okay, so we've seen for the analytics side, and we've jumped back in time back to before the analytics data was present, to now take a look at remote config, because remote config dovetails nicely with it. It's also really cool. So I'm just going to put this in a separate scene, remote config demo, and the reason for that is I want to make sure I'm not spamming the analytics going through. So that can go here, and we're going to create an empty object. config fetcher, and a script for that will also be a similar name. So config fetcher. So to set up the remote config, there's a lot of it we can do from in the inspector. We can also actually do this from that website, the dashboard as well. I'm going to show you how we can do this in the Unity editor. So if we, under window, we'll see we have remote config. I'm going to just dock this window here. And the first thing we want to do is just, because we've newly set this up, we want to do pull, just to make sure that it's actually got the data. So it has this concept of something called environments. So an environment is a cluster of settings. So you would have, for example, the default environment that it has is one called production, so your released version. We might also have an environment for development. So I'm going to create an environment that I call development. That's just useful for when, okay, and it might be having some issues with the website. So this is something where potentially can do a pull again. And if it's not working, then we can go to the dashboard. So there is they've been doing updates to the different ones. So you can run into some issues with that. So this is one where I'm going to switch over to the project. We can come down here to remote config. And if we go to environments, then we can add our development environment here. So we can add development, create that. And then we can test, if we do pull, and see we've got production and development now. So these are two completely separate ones, and they can have different settings. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a setting for, say, controlling verbose logging. And we want to have it that verbose logging is always on in development, but it's off by default in production. Except if you're playing level 2. If you're in level 2, we're going to force that on because there's a couple of really cool things we can do with the remote config like that. So first, we need our setting for the verbose logs. So let's add that in. It's going to be called verbose logs and set the type. So it does support things like JSON, and there's some really cool things it can do there with scriptable objects. In this case, it's a Boolean, and we're in production, so it's going to be false. So that's good. Let's go to development, and we have to add in the same thing. It doesn't allow you to just clone the environment. And this is something that's important. So if we want them saved, then we have to push, so it doesn't preserve all of the local ones. So then we go to development, and we are running into some issues with this. It does have a little bit of problems at times. We can check and see that has actually transferred though, because we can go to our production one. We can see it has actually got it there, which is good. So this is something that you do need to just watch for, that it can be a little bit flaky. There is a little bit of inconsistency between the editor side version and the dashboard side one because there's some updating happening there. So for development, this is going to be true. So let's try pushing that and let's check that that has gone through. So development, so that's good. Excellent, so we've got a setting there. So we want to now retrieve that setting. And so we're going to go to our config fetcher. So there's a couple of things about how we have to approach doing this. So with the process for fetching the config, we need to have, as an initial thing, a function here that is going to be called apply remote settings. And we also need to bring in here using a Unity .remote config. So not a Unity engine, but a Unity dot. And then the actual setting here is a config response. And this is our config response. So we've got that. So first thing we want to do is we want to say, hey, config manager, fetch completed. We want to link that to the apply remote settings. So link to the apply handler. So that's good. We've got that linked up. We need to tell it which configuration to be using, which environment to be using. So we indicate the environment using the ID, which the ID is this string of letters and numbers here. So we have our development ID, and this will be different for every project. So const string environment development equal to this. And we will also have a const string environment production. And to get that, we can just click here over to production. And these changes have been pushed. This is things said of it getting out of sync. So I'm going to switch over to production, grab this ID. So that's good. Then set the environment. So in this case, just for ease of testing, I'm going to use a Boolean for is development. This is something that you could also use a hashif, and then you have something in the actual your build configuration where you're controlling at that point whether this is a development or a release build. So if is development, then we go config manager, set environment ID, environment development, otherwise config manager, set environment, environment production. So that's good. We've linked it, we've set the environment, we've linked to particular ones. We need to actually fetch the settings. So I'm going to have a specific function for this, fetch settings, because this might be something we do it multiple times, and I will actually bring this environment configuration over here just in case it's unlikely we would change that during running, but there might be a particular case where we needed to. So fetch settings. So we set the environment, and then we need to go, hey, config manager, I need you to fetch the configs. And we'll see the only version that this has is a generic one, and it wants us to provide some extra data. So this is where we have user attributes. So this is if there's specific information about the user that we're wanting to provide through. So it might be something like the level. And then we also can pass through stuff about the actual application itself. So this could be stuff like the platform. So we could have, we'll be able to see, we could have different config come through depending upon the platform, which is really, really handy. So I'm going to create these here, and we have then user attributes, attributes, and we need to give it new versions of those. So for now, I'm going to say user attrib is a new user attributes, and app attrib is a new app attributes. Now these can be empty, so this is why to start off with I'm having one empty and one not. I'll also have a setup here for the level, which I'm just going to make as 1. So user attribute level. So we're just configuring that so it has that information. And then we pass these in. That will cause it to fetch the configs, which will then cause it to run this section. So we can then check here, well, config response, what did you actually get back? And it gives us back a bunch of different things. So we can check the request origin. And at origin, if we get back default, that means it, for whatever reason, didn't retrieve the data and we should just use our default settings. The other one, where we wouldn't typically make any changes potentially, is request origin might be cached. But with that, we actually could read our particular settings. But we might have already applied those. So if we assume we've already applied them, then in these cases, we would be able to be saying, well, debug log, no change, defaults or cached. But we could do different behavior there if we needed. Now, the other response we could get back is config response that can be remote, which means we successfully got data. So what we can then do is we can read that. So we can go, okay, well, config manager. So we don't go via the response, we go via the config manager. We can say, okay, well, app config, get, you can see we've got a lot of different things we can be retrieving. So in this case, what I was storing was a Boolean. And if we remember, that Boolean was verbose underscore logs. So I can say get bool verbose underscore logs. Verbose logs. And then I can just log that out. Debug log, verbose logs. So we can see what it actually retrieved. So what we're expecting is to see that when I am in a development build, verbose logs is true. And when I'm in a release build, verbose logs is false. So let's take a look. We're currently in a development build. So let's run it and see what we get. So we got back true, which is what we expect. We can then also say, okay, well, let's change it to a release build. And in a release build, we expect that to be false, which is good. But say we had that problem where there's something wrong with level 2 and we want verbose logs. We can do that. And this is where rules come in. So this rule might be verbose logs for level 2. Now condition, that app and user data that we were sending through, we can query that. So we could say, okay, well, if user.level is equal to 2, doesn't have a start date or an end time, it's affecting everyone, but this is something where you could have settings that affect a certain percentage that are only active between a certain day and time, really handy. Can choose this setting, and okay, verbose logs, you're going to force that to true, and then the key thing is you then also need to enable it. And I'm going to push those settings because we need to make sure those settings are across. So what I expect to see now is we can run and I should see that come through as false, which is correct. And then if I change my level to 2 and then run it. So it's going to go fetch the configuration, but now that configuration is true. So we're able to apply settings that will change based upon the data that has come through. And we can apply this to particular segments and groups, which is really handy. It's a really, really powerful way of being able to work with this, which is hugely, hugely useful for if you're trying to track down problems or if you want to test out different versions or different stats for something. You could use this for tweaking and adjusting game balance dynamically. And that's a really powerful thing. And you could do this for enabling particular features. So if you had like a holiday event, you could turn that holiday event on by a remote config or turn on specific stages of that event by remote config, which is a really cool way of being able to actually work with this. Now, you will have noticed during a bunch of the testing with the remote config that we are seeing this message, a native collection is being not been disposed. This is something that is a minor issue within the package itself. It's not going to typically cause any stability issues. It is a known issue that's on Unity's radar, and it looks like it's an interaction with the web requests. So don't be alarmed if you're seeing that. It is something that is being looked into there and being worked on for being sorted out. It's a cleanup issue with web requests there for when it's fetching that configuration. But the key thing is, we've now got something where we can fetch configurations, where we can set up custom rules. And once we've tracked down the issue with level 2, okay, cool, I'm going to turn that rule off. And now we're back to not having verbose logs on. We'll see that what we'll get back will be false because that setting has now been updated. Now, just to recap, we took a look at analytics and remote configuration. Analytics allow us to gather data, but we need to be very mindful that there are some fairly strict limits there that we must adhere to. Otherwise, that data won't be present. We also need to be mindful of the fact that there are delays on that data coming through. So we won't get instantaneous data there when we're doing our testing. So we do need to be aware of that. We also saw remote configuration, where we can easily set up some different settings and retrieve those, and then based upon the version of our game or where users are at, we can retrieve different sort of information and settings there to be able to actually serve different data. So it allows us to enable and disable different things, could turn on extra logging, could enable particular events, could adjust game balance there. Lots of really cool things we can be doing there with it. So grab the code and experiment with it and see the kinds of things that you can be setting up and getting running there. And the full code for the project is available up on GitHub. As always, you can freely use this code in any of your own projects, whether those are commercial or non-commercial ones. If you've got any queries, chuck in a comment below. If you found stuff helpful, then to chuck in a like and subscribe. If you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, and the link to that is in the description below.